So you may struggle with identifying your own characteristics. But what about when it comes to creatures in fantasy storytelling? Now, I've spent a lot of time with developing my own monster, creature, whatever you want to call that, system of world building in my own personal storytelling that I've been creating on this channel. So it's my time to be able to present to you my top 5 tips that I've been using to best replicate and create a strong foundational monster system. Let's dive into this. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is do a quick showcase of my monster species system that I have in place in the Valaris Codex that I've been working on here. I will be showcasing to all of you the Void Touch species. It's a very specific classification of monster type. There's 2 different types, the Aetherborn and the Void Touched. Now, the Void Touched have their designated origin that is in the realm of Nithra, and they are built under a classification system. Basically, it's called the threat level assessment. So we start with mobs, the elites, the boss types, and the anoms, and it goes in an ascending order. So the mobs, they are the lesser species when it comes to the lower threat level, and it ranges up to higher for the elites, boss level monsters, and the anoms are the very incredibly rare species that just one person would never want to be in a fight with, for the exact reason that they tend to have rule breaking mechanics, quote unquote, if you think about it that way. The breakdown of how Void Touch species work, the threat level assessment is a great tool to be able to standardize the power system and how each of them work. One of the things that I also find difficult is a naming convention that doesn't apply to their class type. I have everything built on a 5-tier class system, and generally how I've been trying to focus on here is I call this a path of the name of the species, whatever it is. And therefore the tier system, or the progression of their level over time, is going to be providing the enhancement associated to that name. So a tier 2 is going to be recognized as corrupted, tier 3 is fractured, tier 4 is entropic, and tier 5 is hollow. But it's all based on whatever their base rarity is. If the base rarity in this case is tier 1, then you get the added on prefix of those ascending tiers. So going based off of the Stalker, it's a mob type starting at tier 1. You get to see a combat ratio involvement and also the quick description of the mechanics of how this thing plays out. We have Path of the Monolith, which is a tank type. It's a hybrid ratio between melee and magic. It's following the same system, but it's based on a base rarity of 1. Now for me, mob threat levels are going to be starting at tier 1. And then once I get onto the elites, they start at tier 2. So therefore tier 1 doesn't exist because the base rarity is tier 2. But they continue that prefix of building upon the ascending tiers going upward. Fractured, entropic, hollow. Path of the Enervator. So the Enervators are the enchanter types. Path of the Atrophy, anti-synergist tank. It's basically an anti-support, but also a tank at the same time, trying to pair these things together to create a difference of trying to break free from traditional archetype standards. I really want to talk more on in the future of developing a new system of archetypes, really trying to provide more innovation into the gamified atmosphere nowadays. My honest opinion, there is truly not enough innovation nowadays in nowadays big ticket games, and I want to see more of that pushed in, not only inside storytelling, but also in the gamified mechanics. Path of the Defiler is the mage archetype. Path of the Evoker, an assassin type. Path of the Hydra, the first boss threat level monster, which is recognized as a ranged behemoth. This doesn't really justify what exactly it is. I need to change that one, but you get the idea. As I'm trying to stray away from just traditional measures of archetypes. Path of the Harvester. So this one's starting to get more original in terms of the basis of the overall world building concepts of monsters. We have a new archetype called Adaptive Hybrid. So it's a very much mixed type, being once again a 50-50 ratio between melee and magic. Path of the Devourer, yet another adaptive hybrid, starting at a threat level of a boss monster. Still mixed, but provide a different ratio breakdown. Path of the Desolator, a mixture of a tank summoner, and this one is technological based. Think of a living embodiment of a monster that possessed a type of technology. And I think that's always been a cool, it's something that's not utilized very often, but I think it's a very cool mechanic, and I'm bringing it back. Path of the Nytherian, and based off of the naming convention here, I may actually change it to the Assimilator, which is actually the archetype. Comment down below on what you think, if I should change that over. In the original story, when I had this made up, I called it the Nytherian, but really I think if I were to follow the naming convention that you're seeing from the other monsters that I've used, the Assimilator would make a lot more sense. Path of the Apathy. Apathy is a brand new archetype, and it's actually going to, based on the definition of the literal word apathy. And for those of you who do not know, oh shoot, I forgot, I gotta change it over. And for those of you who do not know what this word means, well, I'll actually type it in and define it for you so that it makes more sense. It is a lack of feeling, emotion, interest, or concern about important things. In other words, it has no care for others. And that's how this archetype actually plays out, is the fact that is it a monster beast that is capable of summoning other monsters that are lesser beings of itself, but then it devours them to become stronger and restore itself. So it's quite literally, the archetype isn't just the name of the monster, it's also the branding of this new type of how it interacts in the world. Getting on to the last couple ones here. So the Path of the Obliterator, a Soul Severer archetype, once again trying to bring in something new with these rare type species of anoms, which, and I didn't actually discuss why I came up with the word anom. Anom is short for anomaly, which in all reality is just quite literally a very rare circumstance. Path of the Singularity, Path of the Eschaton, as well as the very last one, which is Path of the Entropy, which is the only base tier 5 starting monster in this world building context that I've created here. So therefore, it doesn't have any other prefix names associated to it. It's just the Entropy. Now that I've showcased all of this here, now let me go ahead and show you the 5 tips that I have a general understanding of what has pushed me to create this in the structure that I've made it. And so for tip number 1, is going to be focus on themes. Providing the short description here, of course, I'll go into depth, but what does the monster represent in the setting? Fear, corruption, an ancient mistake? The theme should dictate everything else. From an ascending order of importance, the first and foremost thing you really need to consider is the overall theme, because if you don't follow anything else from what the theme is, then it no longer makes sense in your world building, and then you really need to go back to the drawing board because you got to go back to step 1. Tip number 2 that I come up with, and it's the fact that once you have the theme in place, now you need to streamline the naming convention. So create a unified naming style as if belonging together naturally to the same evolutionary family. So once again, if I go back into the codex, some of these monsters have Y sounding endings. So entropy, singularity, and then others have that ER-OR ending of obliterator. Apathy is another Y ending. Not that one. That one's unique. Desolator, Devourer, Harvester. Hydra is a little bit on the unique side once again. But the naming convention that I was striving for was following corruption, horror, besides the very unique context of the late stage monsters that are incredibly powerful. They are going to have something that's a little bit more profound, godlike in nature. So therefore, that's why there's a slight difference in the unique characteristics of the naming convention for some of those. But otherwise, you still see the naming convention following for all the others. The Evoker, the Defiler, Atrophy, another Y ending, Enervator, Husk. Short, simple, it is what it is. Path of the Remnant. That's a very dreaded horror aspect. Remnant, Monolith, and Stalker. When you see all of these names, the one thing you need to remember in your naming convention is if you can literally list all of them out one by one on a bulleted point setup, and you have to understand, do all of these sound like they should exist together? Because if they don't, then you may need to go back and change some of the names. And quite frankly, how many still need to, but you get the general understanding that all of these in some shape, form, or style, they fit together. especially under the theme of the story. Tip number 3 that has worked incredibly well for me, and that is the mechanics must match the themes. So you have a theme, you have a name for this creature. Now all of a sudden, what are the mechanics? What does this thing do? So the lore has to align with the action. The mechanic needs to directly reflect the creature's origin, making it feel deeply rooted in your system. Your world building is everything. So therefore, if you're going to have the identifier of what this thing is, you know what it's supposed to exist inside. Now you generate the mechanics where it feels normal and represented in whatever form you're trying to make it be. And once again, for me, a lot of the scenarios, it's all about corruption in some form of generating corruption onto their foes that they attack when it comes to the void touch species. Tip number 4, apply world integration. So going back through once again, you have the theme, you have the identifier, and the mechanics that are provided to that identifier. Now you apply the world building concepts of the integration, integrate it into the world. How does this thing compare into the world, to the standard of the world basis that you've created now? What are the designated strengths, the flaws, as well as what does this thing just create an impact for in what you're trying to build? Does it have an impact at all? Maybe it doesn't, because that's the difference for me when it came to the threat levels and those classifications. The mobs they're not nearly as impactful compared to anoms. Great example. And lastly, tip number 5, once you have all of these other pieces together, you should be able to visualize the full profile of what it is, of what the creature is. So based on the mechanical design of what it's supposed to do, the interactivity in the world, the name that it has associated, as well as how it ties to the theme of the story, now you should absolutely be able to visualize what this thing looks like. And if you can, fantastic, you've done it. That's exactly what you wanted, right? And that's the point in time where you're going to start feeling really good about what you created, because then you start adding more monsters into this fantasy style world building context, and it all starts to make sense. And just for a quick reference point as well, another case study that's not just what I've created, I'll give you another great example of a game that is actually one of my favorites, and it's the Left 4 Dead series. How does Left 4 Dead have a great interpretation for these same 5 tips? It's really simple. So the overall theme is a zombified world that has a viral outbreak. So that's an easy theme to be able to think over. When they streamlined the naming convention, they created multiple special infected. So they don't just have common infected, they have the smoker, the boomer, the hunter. Notice that all 3 of those have ER names, endings. And then all of a sudden you had the unique one, the tank, and which is the most powerful, questionably the most powerful form of the special infected zombies. So therefore the tank was different and unique compared to the others, but it still fits in the overall world building branding that is Left 4 Dead. And I can't believe I forgot the witch. How did I forget the witch? The witch is a special infected too, which is also unique and different from the others, but still makes sense why the witch exists in the context. And when they thought about the mechanics of how the smoker is, the smoker literally has smoke floating around it. And that's how they came up with the name the smoker, right? It's pretty simple. The mechanics match the name, which also match the theme of a zombified world. And because of that same reason, and once you apply the smoker and the hunter and the boomer to the world itself, all of a sudden you can absolutely visualize how these things work. So this was a quick one today, but I tell you what, it was really cool to be able to showcase some of the things that I've been working on for all this time, but then also providing an actual case study of how these 5 tips apply so incredibly well to something that's already been established deeply into the gaming universe, specifically the Left 4 Dead series that is incredibly successful. If you found these tips incredibly helpful, leave a comment down below on what you think is something else that I could touch upon next, because one of the things that I really want to do is to start providing more innovation to some of these mainline games of, say, for example, the Left 4 Dead series. And it's because we never ended up getting Left 4 Dead 3, we got Back 4 Blood, which I'm going to be honest, it just doesn't have the nostalgia of the older games. But what if we provided more innovation, thinking about what Left 4 Dead 3 could have been for new special infected, for new characters, for new all of this other stuff. And by the way, those 5 tips, They don't just have to be applied to monsters and creatures. They could literally be provided to the same aspects of developing characters and really providing character development as well. It's very simplified, but it's super easy to work with. And that's why I'm telling you to go ahead, try this out yourself, see how it works. And quite frankly, I have a whole lot more world building to continue to create, and it's not going to end today. As always, my name's AveyaZ. Thanks for being here, and you take it easy. I'll see you next time.